Hi again, Greg and Dave Boling here at Seahawks headquarters with final practice for the second preseason game tomorrow night at CenturyLink Field against Minnesota. The news of the day was that for the first time after months of being optimistic about Jimmy Graham's being able to return in time for the season opener, Pete Carroll mentioned for the first time the possibility Graham won't be available. He said that they will bring it probably up until the week of the first regular season game, September 11th against Miami. And then they will determine whether he can play or not then. They aren't sure at this point. It could go either way. Suffice to say, this has always been a possibility. This is the first time that Sonny Pete Carroll has said something other than, yes, we're counting on him. The quote had been, we're kind of counting on both he and Thomas Rawls to start the season. First of all, what do you make of what Pete said, and also what might that mean?
You know, he made a point to hedge his bet. We're going to wait and see, and apparently a lot of that will hinge on some more medical evaluations that he's getting early next week. So I think it's possible they could take a look at him. Hey, you're doing great. Go ahead and get back to work. And the big thing that we've seen historically, and as Pete reminded us today, they like to be careful. They're always pretty cautious with guys. As you said, we need him more in November and December than we need him, on September 11th. So I think, it's still a little bit of wait and see, but it might be a little bit more sense of doubt than we might have had before.
What's at play here is that Thomas Rawls came back from the PUP list at the same time, the same week that Jimmy Graham did, so there's an obvious comparison there. But one, it's a very more standard injury that Rawls had. A broken ankle and torn ligaments, as bad as that was for him, is a pretty clear recovery. There's a lot of unknowns in a patellar tendon recovery, that ruptured patellar tendon and surgery that Jimmy Graham
especially for a guy who's 6'6", he's now 260, it was 275 at the time, who's going to be doing a lot of cutting. It's not like a running back who has to do a lot of cutting and to be quick on his feet and far more nimble. But he's a big guy, and I don't think they feel any reason to rush it now. And maybe he won't be 100% Jimmy Graham the whole season. So it's there's a lot information to be gathered yet. But I think they have some people at tight end that you're not going to be thinking, oh my goodness, this really changes the point spread chances, or it's certainly fantasy players are going to be concerned about Jimmy Graham's status.
Red alarms,
which is not something that we generally think about too much. But as the team approaches the regular season, they do. Luke Wilson played quite a bit last year. I think Brandon Williams. They're better off than they have been in terms of depth.
I think the possibility of Graham not starting the season makes it a distinct possibility the Seahawks keep 4 tight ends this year, because they drafted Nick Vannett in the 3rd round from Ohio State, and you don't normally cut a 3rd round draft pick. Speaking of 3rd round draft picks, C.J. Prosise has been back to practice this week after 2.5 weeks out with a hamstring, but Pete Carroll said Prosise, the 3rd down running back scheduled for the season, won't play against Minnesota. Thomas Rawls, I was about to mention the comparison, he came back to practice this week with the first team. He won't play tomorrow night. Again, there's no reason to, but it looks like Graham will play in one of those final 2 preseason games. Rawls will likely play in one of the last 2 preseason games. Jamarcus Webb won't play tomorrow night, the right tackle, which means it'll be Jimmy Graham, I've got him on my mind, which means it'll be
Gary Gilliam
at right tackle, Bradley Sowell at left tackle, the same lineup that was in Kansas City, and Jari Evans will continue to be the second team right guard.
And I think that this is another thing for us to look at. Game 2, in my mind, seems like a validation game for the guys who played pretty well. I want to see if this offensive line can once again, the starting unit particularly, be fairly effective as they were against Kansas City, against the Vikings. Trevon Boykin made some flashy plays, I thought, particularly at the end of the Kansas City game. Can he take that next step? Tyvis Powell, Cassius Marsh, guys who had very impressive games. I think they need to build on that, and it'll be a very interesting Thursday night.
Pete Carroll mentioned that he wants to see Bradley Sowell at left tackle against Minnesota's pass rush, for instance. Usually the second preseason game, starters for both teams play about a half, a couple quarters, and usually the third preseason game, of course, the final rehearsal is when they come out after halftime and play into the second half. So I'm expecting around 2 quarters, maybe less, for the starters this time. We'll be there in the press box tomorrow in Seattle. Thanks for joining us.